In this, our 10th lecture in our course on the lessons that we might learn from the great books of history, we continue our exploration of the second of our themes, that is to say, the decisions we make at each stage of our life. We have looked at Johann Wolfgang Goethe and his work on the sufferings of the young Werther, and as an instance of how a young person decides to kill himself over love. And we've looked at Hamlet in terms of how a young person makes the decision that he must avenge his father and brings destruction on his family, his country, and himself. And then we saw that age doesn't bring us much wisdom because Ajax, the height of his fame, decided he had to kill himself over a sense of outraged reputation and honor. I suppose all three of those, Werther, Hamlet, Ajax, we might call today obsessive personalities, wouldn't we? But I think all of us are a little obsessive. Each one of us has something that we take far too seriously, and we make mistakes. And this lecture is all about mistakes. The greatest people admit their mistakes. I think the two most important statesmen of the 20th century were Winston Churchill and Gandhi of India, Mohandas Gandhi. Both of them said they made mistakes and admitted them. Churchill, writing his history of the Second World War, tells how he was bitterly opposed to the landing at Normandy. He looked back to the First World War, to the disastrous British amphibious landing at Gallipoli in the Dardanelles, the 120,000 British soldiers that were lost, the pain of that loss as well as the disaster of his career. And he said, I was wrong. Gandhi said, I make mistakes, and when I make them, they are Himalayan in size. I make the biggest possible mistakes. And I take comfort as I make one mistake after another in the fact that the wisest person who ever lived, I believe, Plato, made mistakes and admitted them. Plato, he is at the center of any discussion of great books. It has been rightly said that Plato set such a course for philosophy that everything afterwards has just been a series of footnotes to Plato. That he dealt with all of the important questions that concern us in our search for wisdom. The Republic, the life of Socrates, his Apology, the Phaedo, the Crito, the Euthyphro, the Timaeus, Critias, these all live through history as deep attempts to understand the most fundamental of questions. What is justice? What is the meaning of our life? What is the nature of the universe? What is the nature of God? Is the soul immortal? And Plato made one big mistake, he said, when he decided for a period to get involved in politics. All of us have a tendency to make that decision. I believe that each one of us has one destiny that we are meant to fulfill. And the happy person is the person who discovers that and does it to their full limits. But there is always a tendency for us to say, well, I'm not really meant to be doing this. I could do so much more. I'm a good teacher, but teachers aren't important. I want to be a dean. Or I'm a minister, but preaching to people isn't enough for me and taking care of them. I want to be a bishop. And I'm really good as a salesperson. That's what I like doing. But I want to be the vice president and have a job managing other people. So we get lured into these decisions. In fact, Sophocles, if he could come back, would say that's all a case of the fatal blindness we looked at last time. The fatal blindness that leads us into disastrous mistakes. A kind of hubris, as the Greeks said, that leads us into taking an action that will be disastrous. And Plato got involved in politics in Sicily, believing that he could really make a change in the way the politics work. Plato was born in 429, and he discusses his career in his seventh letter, his seventh epistle. Some scholars have debated the authenticity of the collection of letters that have come down to us from Plato and ascribed to him, but the seventh, I think, quite clearly is Plato. And if you've read Plato and you read it, you know it's Plato speaking to you. Plato says he had been born and raised in the Athenian democracy that we looked at in our last lecture, that first government to be based on the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of citizens, that government to believe that every citizen was capable of handling any governmental function, that believed that government should be government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And he said, as I grew up, members of my family had been politicians in Athens, and I was determined to follow a career of public service. That is what I was meant to do. So when I reached my mid-20s, having studied intensely and having been a student of Socrates, I got ready to enter politics. But the Athenian democracy had not learned from all the wisdom of the tragedies of Sophocles. It had chosen in 431 BC to involve itself in a preemptive war against Sparta. And they thought it would be a short, quick war, that Sparta was conspiring against Athens, and that they would win glory and peace. Instead, the war went on year after bloody year, and it finally ended in 404 in the complete destruction of Athens. The loss of its empire, the loss of its navy, became a Spartan dependency. And the Spartans placed in control at Athens a group of 30 men, a group of dictators. And it was just at that moment, Plato said, that I decided to go into politics. That should have been a sign to me that this was not a good political atmosphere and I should do something else. But no, I wanted to be in politics. But I was devoted to Socrates. And my teacher had said, no good man can survive in the democracy of Athens. It is so corrupt that it will destroy any person who is really trying to do good things. And sure enough, they tried to make Socrates part of their reign of terror. And he stood up against them and said, I will not commit an unjust act. I will not arrest this man that you are determined to put to death. Well, they would have put Socrates to death, but they collapsed. Their government collapsed, and the democracy came back. And all of us hope now we'll have freedom again. But a democracy is just as tyrannical as any group of dictators. In fact, you can kill a dictator. You cannot kill the whole people. And the majority is a vicious tyrant. And they hated Socrates just for being good. And they brought against him the most untrue charges, that he was a traitor, that he corrupted the young, that he was an atheist, and he was put to death. He had to drink poison. My teacher, the best, the wisest, most just man of his day. I determined right then and there not to get involved in politics. I wasn't going to have any part of it. And I realized that God had called me to be a teacher and to go in pursuit of wisdom. That is what philosophy truly is. Philosophia, the search for wisdom, for the wisdom to know how to live your life. And as a teacher, I should continue the mission of Socrates. That is why I made Socrates the speaker in all of my dialogues. I wanted to write the way he had taught. I wanted to engage the mind, to go in the exploration of truth. And he was my spokesperson because I would not have lived without Socrates. Oh, there might have been a person named Plato, but the intellectual life I have, I owe to my teacher. So there I was, happily working along, winning some fame, even winning a lot of enemies, people who were jealous of me. But I went along writing and stayed completely out of the politics of the Athenian democracy. And in midlife, when I was 40 years of age in 388, I got an invitation to come and lecture in Sicily. Yes, the intellectuals of those days got invitations to go off and lecture at high fees, and they did it. I could always use the money to help improve my modest academy there in Athens, so I agreed to go to Sicily. And I was brought to Sicily by the great ruler, dictator, called himself king, Dionysius of Sicily. Dionysius, from about 405 BC down to his death in 367 BC, was one of the most important figures in the Greek world. He had risen to power in democratic Syracuse in the years after Syracuse had beaten back the attempt by the Athenians to conquer them. He had made himself dictator with the complete consent of the people because they realized their democratic government wasn't functioning. And he had gone on to protect all of Greek civilization in Italy and in Sicily from the attempt by the Carthaginians to conquer it, the barbarians as the Greeks saw them. Then he went on to bring peace and prosperity to his native land of Sicily. He made Syracuse, this Greek colony, into the most famous city in its age, the richest, most prosperous. And he sponsored Greek culture. So he brought Plato. Plato says he brought me out there to see if I wouldn't accept a teaching post there. And I stayed for some months, and I was impressed with Dionysius, but I understood there were also flaws with it. But it put in my mind the idea that the real way to bring about justice in the world, and that is the most important thing for government to do, is to have justice, was to have one man as powerful as Dionysius, but educated in wisdom. I didn't stay all that long in Sicily. I gave my lectures, and I wasn't all that impressed with the Sicilians. Plato might have said the way some Europeans say of Americans. Everything seemed so big there. The temples were bigger than anything we had in Greece. They weren't more refined, but they sure were they were very gaudy looking. The lifestyle was very lavish. The Sicilians were never satisfied with one meal in the day. They always had to have 2 big meals. And the more elaborate the menu, the better it was. The more they had to bring in fish from far off, and the way they had to eat specialized cuisines and have elaborate sauces. I think sometimes of a menu. You go into a restaurant in Kansas City, and they have all this fish from Australia and New Zealand and places like that. Or these elaborate desserts that go around that everybody says, no, I can't eat that, but then they get it, right? This huge mound of chocolates and things like that. Well, that's what Sicily was like, and Plato said I was glad to go back. But I did begin to write more. And I had struck up a close friendship with the brother of Dionysius, Dion. We became very good friends, and he studied with me. And he absorbed my knowledge. He was one of my most brilliant students. And the more we talked, the more he kept saying, if we could only have a king who was a philosopher, can you not imagine how much good would be brought to the world? And when Dionysius died in 367, he was succeeded by his son Dionysius. Called him Dionysius II. And my friend Dion wrote to me and said, come back. Come back right now and become the tutor for my nephew. I am his closest advisor. He loves philosophy. He's a very good student. And he begs me to have you, Plato, come and be his teacher. And we will educate a philosopher king. Well, I knew it was a bad idea. But still, you ought to take an action, shouldn't you? You ought to go and do something. I went back. I went to Sicily. And almost immediately, I realized I was completely out of my depth. No good person can ever be successful in politics, because to be a successful politician, you have to be very suspicious, don't you? You have to act as though you believe everybody is nice, and you have to, in your mind, believe they're all trying to destroy you. You've got to lie constantly. You've got to do many unjust acts. I mean, that's just the way politics is. And I found that I was in a court of constant intrigue, that Dion was not favored by his nephew. In fact, the nephew looked upon his uncle as a real danger, thinking that his uncle was conspiring to get the throne. And he constantly listened to slanders, first against Dion, his uncle, then against me. And my enemies there, and they were many. They hated me just because I was a person with some wisdom, and I would point out the flaws in the system, whereas they were only concerned with exploiting the system for themselves. Great pork barrel schemes. So they began to say, why do you think this foreign Athenian was brought here? He is clearly conspiring with Dion to overthrow you. Suddenly then, having been there a few months, trying to get my school established, trying to give lectures to this tyrant, that's what he was, Dionysius. He wasn't a king, he was a tyrant. I found Dion had been exiled. Well, I said, I'm getting out of this place. And Dionysius said, I have nothing against you. Please stay and be my teacher. I know I haven't been turning in my assignments regularly, but we've had all this trouble. But now I'm going to really focus on the course. Don't you have some extra credit that I can do? I said, no, I'm going back to Athens. So I did. And I was happily back in Athens, but I continued to ponder this. And by 360, I had finished my book, The Republic, in which I laid out what the truly just, perfect country would be, the perfect constitution for a free country, a country that was truly free. And in it, I began my dialogue, as I always do, with my friend Socrates, and he is in search for justice. And he debates with another old Athenian, what is the true meaning of justice? And the old Athenian says what every Greek would tell you, why it is doing good to your friends and punishing your enemies. I think probably some politicians would tell you that today too, wouldn't they? They have long memories. So it is paying off your friends and doing a lot of harm to your enemies. And Socrates said, you don't believe that it is doing good to your enemies? You see, I believe that anybody can do evil to their enemies, but the truly just person does good, returns good for evil. Socrates then goes on to sketch that the foundation of a truly good government must be justice. And the rulers and the individual citizens all must be possessed of the following fundamental principles. The cardinal virtues, as they would come to be called: wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. Justice. It is how you deal with other humans. It is doing good. It is doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. That is exactly how Socrates defines it. Courage. It is standing up for justice. And moderation is knowing that an action must be tempered by responsibility. It is knowing that when courage in pursuit of the wrong ideal is simply brutality. Moderation is making the right choices in your life. And wisdom. Wisdom takes all the information you have, it takes all of the knowledge that you have, and it gives you the true wisdom to live your life by these principles. And then I sketched how if you had a king who was invested with this wisdom, who had been educated by a rigorous program of training in the truth, then he could bring about this new republic. And you would educate the young generation in these principles, and so it would continue. Well, I got a letter one day in the mail after the book had come out, and it was Dion again. And he said, we haven't corresponded for a while, but I know you've been keeping up with events in Sicily. I believe that Dionysius has had a change in heart. He has written me this lovely letter asking me to come back and begging me to get you to come back. So I'd like you to go back, old friend, and test the waters. Go, Plato, and see what it's really like. See if Dionysius is really willing to go back to school, and then I'll come back and we'll have that perfect republic, just the way you've described in your book. I don't know. I think this is a really bad idea. But one day a messenger came to Plato's office there in the academy and said, a great warship has just arrived, but lavishly decked out like a huge yacht. And here's a letter from King Dionysius of Sicily telling you that the yacht is at your disposal, consider it your own, all expenses paid, very large honorarium, just come and be his teacher again. Well, how could you turn down a private yacht? Be like being offered a cruise, wouldn't it, of the Greek islands just to give a few lectures. And he gets an honorarium to boot. So, all right, I'm going to go. I think it's a mistake, but who can turn this down? And besides, I'll do some good. See, that's what always gives me comfort. He had already been burned twice in Sicily. He is going back a third time. Well, off he goes, and he arrives and meets with his new pupil, and there's a lavish banquet for him, and he gives some speeches and lectures. And then after several days, he mentions to Dionysius, aren't we going to start our classes now? And Dionysius said, you know, I've read all your books. I think I know everything. In fact, did you know I've written my own book? No, I didn't know that. Yeah, I believe it's better than your books. But I'm glad you're here, and we'll have other people judge it, but I am really a philosopher now. I see. Yes, and I have written a book on wisdom and how to obtain wisdom, and it's a bestseller here in my court. Everybody seems to want to have a copy of it, and everybody's quoting it. So I don't know if we really need a rigorous course, but tell me what you have in mind. Well, what I have in mind is, first of all, you have to study math. What, math? Why, Plato, are you crazy? No, geometry. That's written over the doorway of our academy. Let no one enter this hall of learning who doesn't know geometry. You see, it is through geometry that we learn the perfection of the divine forms. The what? The perfection of the divine forms. You just said you had read all my books. Yeah, yes, I have. I think maybe that page I've forgotten a little bit. Remind me about that. You don't remember about name and definition? Name, definition. I don't believe I know that. All right. Remember, Dionysius, we start with information. If we want to pursue any subject, we start with information. Why, later generations will collect this off the internet. So we get all these facts. That gives us a name, like justice. then we have to define it. And so we define what justice is, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. Yeah, this is getting kind of complicated. Well, then from that, we derive an image of what justice is, a faint reflection of what it is. Yeah? And then we gain knowledge. But ultimately, we want to gain wisdom. I'm not following all of this, and I've got another appointment. Yeah, I'm text messaging somebody right now, but we'll come back and talk about this. So Plato shows up the next day and says, well, let's start with geometry again. Name, a circle. Definition, we define a circle, equidistant from every point. And then we can draw a circle. That gives us an image. And so we have a knowledge of what a circle is. But the true meaning of a circle, its infinity, that is only the wisdom that comes to us in a flash. Flash from where? A flash from God. Oh, I say. Well, anyway, I'll tell you what I want to ask you about now. This is great. We're going to continue with these course of studies. No doubt about that, Plato. You're a real philosopher. I can see that. But I've got to have your help with a little matter. What is it? Well, it's a practical matter, but I think you could give me some sound advice. I have the entire estate, 100 talents, that belongs to my Uncle Dion, here in a bank account in Sicily. 100 talents. 1 talent is enough to build a warship, so this is a lot of money. And he keeps asking for it. Now, I know I've exiled him to the Peloponnese, but he keeps asking for his money. And he also wants his wife and child to join him. Well, and the trouble is, I think he will misuse the money. So what I am proposing to do, and I want you to get to sign this little form that you're in agreement with this as my closest advisor, is that we'll send 1/2 of the money to him, and then I'll keep the other half and invest it for his child. Does that make a lot of sense? I mean, I'll control it, but I will invest it for the child. You can take me on trust. I will not sign something like this. Did you just bring me all the way from Athens on that yacht to get me to sign this financial document, to take responsibility for it? Oh, absolutely not. I just thought you were a friend of Dion. No, I am not a friend of Dion. I'm not a friend in that way. I love him as a student, and I am not going to be a part of such a scheme. Are you calling me a schemer? I am king of Sicily. You are here at my behest. You only live because I let you live. I could have you killed just like that. Now, you sign this, but I don't want to. It hurt my reputation in Greece, but still, I'll do it. Now, you sign this. No, I will not do it. All right, come back. All right, Dion has written saying, okay, that's a start. All right, and so he's asked you to sign. All right, well, I'll sign it. See, that's another big mistake you make. That's the easy way out. Now, may I please sail back home? The weather's gotten bad. I couldn't risk the yacht at this stage of the summer. It's too late. So you'll have to stay on through the winter. Here's trapped. Here's the wisest man in the world, gotten trapped there in Sicily at the court of a tyrant. And he thinks about the verses of Sophocles. He who enters a tyrant's door is a slave, though he was free before. You always think about that when you put yourself into some very high-paying position, but where you're at the absolute control of a boss who wants to use you as a fall person, and they do. And that's all Plato has become, is a fall person. All right, there he is. Then, having signed the document, Dion sees that it's changed around a little bit, and Dionysius, in fact, takes all of Dion's money, sells off his whole estate, and keeps the money. And says, well, you can read this document that Plato has signed and that Dion agreed to in those terms. So here Plato has been made a party to a fraud. And all back in Athens, this is being spread around that here is Plato over there conspiring with Dionysius. All right? And he says, now may I please go home? Now the storms have gotten worse and you better stay here. I don't see any storms. Well, I do. But I'm going to give you a big apartment right in the royal palace. I don't want an apartment in the royal palace. I want to go back to Athens. Well, look, here's your apartment. We got to get back to those courses. Let's start studying again. Well, he does have this lavish apartment. But every time he goes out the door, he has to show his pass. He tries to go out of the palace gates, and they say, well, it's dangerous outside now. There's some riots. So now he's become, as he describes it, like a bird in a cage. Then one day, a messenger comes and says, Dionysius needs the apartment. You're to live way out by the dockyards. And so Plato moves out into these very humble quarters. But now it is winter and it's too late to go back. But Dionysius begins to spread the rumor that Plato is part of a conspiracy to kill the beloved Dion. So people on the streets now begin to threaten Plato and say, you murderer, you assassin, you parricide. Finally, Dionysius lets him go back after he's received a great deal of outside pressure from other Greek leaders. And finally, Plato gets to go back home. Now, back home, he rethinks this whole situation about what a truly just commonwealth is. In the meantime, Dion has been assassinated by two Athenians in the pay of Dionysius. So Dion has been assassinated by two Athenians in the pay of Dionysius. And Dionysius manages to get Plato blamed for that as well. Plato has to sit down and write this long open letter to be published saying exactly what he did in Sicily. That is how much he feels his reputation has been damaged. And now he's an old man. But he starts over again to reformulate what a just commonwealth should be. He realizes from this experience that power is such a corrupting influence that no man or woman can ever be entrusted with it. And he comes to understand that only the law can be the real ruler of a nation. So his final work, his long life comes to an end, is just that, the laws. And he takes just a simple country with ordinary people in it, realizing they're never going to gain in wisdom, that you can give them education and teach them trades, but they're never going to have true wisdom. But you give them a constitution which will come from a committee of the best and wisest in the country, and under that constitution, they can, generation after generation, find peace and prosperity and justice, knowing full well that everybody they elect to office will be corrupted by power in some way, but that justice will continue because of that Constitution. Now, I've told you that the great books make us better as individuals, but they also make us better as citizens. And among those who read the laws of Plato were John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. George Washington knew about them. So it was that after we had won our independence from Britain, after some people had suggested that George Washington should become a king, can you imagine a better king than George Washington? He was truly a man of wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation. Washington said absolutely not. And he was the leading force in bringing together a committee in Philadelphia, 55 men. In fact, Plato had suggested 50 people would be a good number. Don't pay them salaries, but give them honors and awards for their wisdom. And they crafted a constitution in the full knowledge that people are basically self-seeking, but that if you can imbue a nation with a deep belief in its constitution, then generation after generation, justice will be achieved. And that is exactly what has happened in this country. I never despair about the political situation. Yes, you'll have a lot of people you don't like in public office. Yes, the ordinary person will lose confidence in Congress. Yes, dreadful mistakes will be made in foreign policy. There will be terrible social questions. But the American people have never done what the Germans did after World War I and followed the road of dictatorship. They have time and time again followed that Constitution, and it always ultimately produces the right results. In fact, I'm never even upset when ordinary Americans or professors as well or presidents don't know what's in the Constitution. These tests for civic literacy never really faze me. I don't think it's so important that ordinary Americans know exactly what's in the Constitution, but rather that they have imbibed the spirit of the Constitution. And every time a president gets too powerful, or Congress gets too powerful, or anytime anyone wants really to change that Constitution, whether it's the Electoral College or the Supreme Court's power, the Americans bring them right back because they are so deeply believing in that Constitution. And Plato would tell us, yes, that is why you have a republic that has brought more freedom to the world than any other nation in history.